A veteran cop thought he could silence her with handcuffs. He didn't know she carried a badge, too, one that outranked his. The courtroom didn't just turn against him, the nation did. This is the takedown no one saw coming. Kingsboro, Mississippi, a small town draped in moss and old prejudices, was easing into another mild, sunny Tuesday. On Main Street, cafes were just beginning to open, the scent of freshly baked bread mingling with the musty aroma of aging wooden buildings. But the peaceful air was quickly disturbed by a familiar and deeply unsettling presence. Clay Darnell, Clay, 47, was a veteran officer with the Kingsboro Police Department. With a buzz cut, a hulking frame, and heavy steps that echoed on the sidewalk, he had a presence that made people wary from the moment he appeared. For 18 years, Clay had built a reputation no one dared to question, an enforcer of the law, on his own terms. Among the white community, he was seen as the keeper of order, but to the town's black residents, the name Clay Darnell evoked fear and fury. Clay didn't need a slogan about justice. To him, if something felt wrong, that was reason enough to act. He once arrested a young black boy for riding his bicycle too close to a gated community. His report cited suspicious behavior. He had used his baton to restore order during a street performance, simply because the song was sung in a soulful black voice. The complaints? Silenced. Quietly swept away by supervisor protection and a community long conditioned to the cost of speaking out. That morning, Clay sat in his Ford Explorer patrol vehicle, parked on a street corner near Magnolia Bean Cafe, a favorite spot for the town's middle-class white residents. Through the windshield, his eyes narrowed at the sight of a sleek black BMW parked near the entrance. Behind the wheel sat a black woman in a tailored suit, sipping a cappuccino while flipping through documents. Her legs were crossed, her demeanor composed. "You think this place is for you?" Clay muttered, his voice steeped in contempt. No sirens, no call for backup. Just one thought pulsed through Clay's mind. Act now. He opened the door, his hand brushing the holster, a threatening habit, then walked over. His boots pounded against the curb like a warning of trouble approaching. License and registration. He barked. No greeting, no explanation. There was nothing in his tone that spoke of service to a citizen. The woman looked up, meeting his eyes with calm clarity. "Good morning, officer. May I ask, what's the reason I'm being stopped?" To Clay, that question was a challenge. And in his world, anyone who didn't know their place had to be corrected. Celeste Monroe, 44, with warm bronze skin and steady confidence, calmly set her cup and holder as Clay Darnell's eyes swept across the car window like a silent threat. She recognized that look. She was no stranger to it. Years spent working in New Orleans had put her before dozens of juries, arguing with stubborn attorneys, fighting tooth and nail for victims the system had abandoned. But Clay's stare wasn't born of legal reasoning. It was the smugness of a man convinced his power would never be questioned. Clay tapped the hood of the car, his gaze dripping with contempt. "License and registration," he repeated, louder this time. Celeste lowered the window, her hand steady even as her heart pounded. "Of course," she said, opening her leather wallet and carefully retrieving her documents. "But I would appreciate knowing the reason for the stop." Clay snatched the license, glancing at the name, but he wasn't really reading it. He didn't care who she was. To him, a black woman in a BMW parked in a white neighborhood was already suspicious enough. "This is a private residential area," he said, ignoring her question. "We've had reports of suspicious activity this morning." "Suspicious activity?" Celeste raised an eyebrow, meeting his stare. "I'm drinking coffee and reviewing case files." He sneered. "You a lawyer? Or just playing dress-up?" Celeste pressed her lips together, suppressing the sting of anger. She had encountered men like Clay before, but it still hit her in the chest each time. Not because of the insult, but because of how familiar it felt. All the years of hard work, all the classes, the exams, the courtrooms, and still, she was being looked at like she didn't belong. "Step out of the vehicle," Clay said, his hand resting on his holster. "Why?" Celeste asked, her tone no longer soft. "I gave you a lawful order," he growled. "You're being disruptive." If you don't comply, I'll arrest you for obstructing a law enforcement officer. The tension snapped taut like a wire. A few meters away, an elderly woman walking her dog stopped, watching intently. A young boy stepping off a school bus turned his head. Celeste took a deep breath, opened her car door, and stepped out, her heels tapping softly against the pavement. She stood tall, hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes locked on Clay. "You're making a serious mistake," she said, voice low and firm. Clay smirked. "I've heard that one before." But this time he didn't yet know the woman standing before him not only had valid documents, but carried a force that would shake the entire town of Kingsborough. Clay Darnell tightened his grip on the holster, the veins in his neck rising as Celeste held her gaze steady, her calmness unnerved him more than yelling ever could. To him, power wasn't something to be questioned, especially not by a well-dressed black woman who carried herself like she belonged. "Place your hands on the hood," Clay barked, his voice slicing the air. Celeste didn't move. "What are you arresting me for?" "Disturbing the peace and resisting a law enforcement officer." "Resisting? For asking why?" She tilted her head slightly, her voice still quiet, but each word fell like a stone. "And who's actually disturbing the peace here?" Clay stepped forward, pulling the handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest," he said. A few bystanders began recording with their phones. A middle-aged woman in gym clothes covered her mouth and whispered to her friend, "She didn't do anything. I saw the whole thing." Celeste looked at Clay, not with rage, but with a chill, icy calm, like a frozen lake. "You have no idea what you just did," she said, her voice slow and deliberate, like a sentence being read aloud. Clay didn't respond. He leaned down to cuff her, rough enough that the edge of the metal grazed her wrist. Celeste winced but said nothing. She let him escort her like a prisoner. No resistance, no submission. Just a straight-back stride and a gaze that seemed to pierce through the very soul of Kingsborough. He shoved her into the back seat of the patrol car and slammed the door shut. As he turned, he locked eyes with a nearby teenager, black, likely in high school, who was filming everything. The boy didn't speak, but his expression, part disappointment, part defiance, made Clay uneasy. "Move along," Clay barked. But the boy didn't move. Inside the cruiser, Celeste closed her eyes. Her breathing was steady, like someone preparing for battle. She knew how this system worked. And more importantly, she knew exactly who she was. No handcuff, no fabricated report could erase that truth. At the Kingsborough police station, Clay filled out the arrest report, his hands slightly trembling. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of what he considered a clean takedown. He didn't bother to Google the name Celeste Monroe. To him, she was just another arrogant black woman who needed to be taught a lesson. But the real lesson was coming for him. 2 days after the arrest, Kingsborough woke from its long slumber. A nearly 2-minute video posted on TikTok and rapidly shared across Twitter and Reddit sent shockwaves through the community. The footage showed Celeste Monroe, a black woman in a navy blue power suit, being handcuffed on the side of the street while sitting inside a luxury BMW. The moment stunned viewers not only for the actions of white officer Clay Darnell, but for the way Celeste carried herself, with absolute composure in the face of racialized aggression. In the clip, her voice was clear and unshaken. "You have no idea what you just did." 4 seconds later, the video ended with the loud slam of the patrol car door. No one knew who she was, but that presence, that dignity, shook the internet to its core. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Celeste, hashtag Who Is She, and hashtag Kingsborough Arrest began to trend. A Southern political Twitter account reposted the clip with the caption, "She didn't have to yell. She said one line. And I bet that cop's gonna regret it." By that afternoon, the video had reached over 2 million views. Crowds started gathering outside the Kingsborough courthouse. Protest signs appeared. Justice for Celeste. End racial bias in law enforcement. No one is above the law. Reporters from major outlets, CNN, MSNBC, the Associated Press, flooded the once quiet town. Inside the courtroom, not a single seat was empty. A long line of people stretched down the hallway, waiting for a chance to get in. Civil rights advocates like Reverend Lisa Powers and former state legislator Jerome Willis were present. They hadn't come just to observe. They came to witness a turning point that could reshape the face of Southern justice. Clay Darnell entered the courtroom in full uniform, his face wearing the same confident expression it always did. He was used to being protected, used to the nods of approval from those seated in power. In his mind, he was certain he wouldn't be convicted, because he never had been before. But today, something was different. And it wasn't just the size of the crowd. It was the silence, a heavy collective stillness that blanketed the room, as if the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to finally emerge. Celeste Monroe sat at the defendant's table. She wore an elegant gray suit, her hair neatly pinned up, her eyes calm, but unshakably resolute. "Before I proceed, Your Honor," Celeste said, her voice steady and clear, "I believe I should properly introduce myself." She opened her case, pulled out a small leather badge holder, and raised it for all to see. The entire room fell into breathless silence. "I am Celeste Monroe, the federal chief prosecutor for the Southern District of Mississippi under the United States Department of Justice. I've spent my career fighting for justice and against abuse of power. My wrongful arrest is a living example of what many citizens here endure every single day." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Some reporters dropped their pens. Camera flashes erupted like fireworks. The presiding judge paused for a beat, then shifted upright in her chair. Clay, meanwhile, had gone completely pale, like someone had pulled the ground out from beneath his belief system. "And today," Celeste continued, "I do not stand here solely as a wronged citizen, but as a federal official whose civil rights were violated in the very place meant to uphold justice." She held up a USB stick. "On this device are 3 independent video recordings, capturing the entire incident, from the moment I was asked for my documents without cause to the moment I was handcuffed and transported, despite showing zero resistance." Judge Nora Whitfield nodded, instructing the technician to play the evidence. The large screen at the back of the courtroom lit up. Footage from a nearby grocery store camera appeared. The audience could clearly see Clay Darnell approaching the black BMW, his hand already resting on his holster, while Celeste remained seated inside, calm, composed, committing no offense. The video fast-forwarded to the confrontation. Clay raising his voice, demanding she exit the vehicle, never providing a specific reason. When Celeste responded with composed questioning, he immediately opened the door, pulled her out, and cuffed her. The room fell dead silent. Some spectators looked away, unable to bear witnessing the injustice again. "And now," Celeste said, stepping forward, "here is a direct eyewitness." The rear door opened, and a young black man, about 20 years old, stepped inside. He was the one who had recorded the second video, the clip that had gone viral and brought national attention to the case. He stood tall, his hands trembling slightly, but his gaze was steady with conviction. "I didn't know who she was at the time," he said. "All I saw was a woman being pulled out of her car because of the color of her skin. I filmed it because it felt wrong." Clay Darnell shook his head, tried to mask his growing discomfort. His attorney stood, preparing to object, but Celeste continued, this time with personnel records. Celeste rose calmly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice not loud but sharp as steel, "I request permission to submit additional documentation, evidence I believe speaks directly to the danger this system has enabled." She pulled out a thick envelope and handed it to the court clerk. "This is an unpublished internal report compiling over 30 complaints filed against Officer Darnell from 2012 to present, at least 8 of which were buried or resolved internally without informing the plaintiffs. Every single one of the victims was a person of color." The sound of camera shutters erupted. A reporter from the Jackson Tribune nearly dropped her pen. The documents were placed on the judge's bench. Jurors began whispering, some scribbling furiously. Judge Nora Whitfield flipped through a few pages, then looked down at Clay. "Would you like to say anything?" she asked. "Before I forward this file to the U.S. Department of Justice?" Clay opened his mouth, stammering, but no words came out. Then came the final blow. Celeste read aloud her own professional summary. Nearly 2 decades as a federal prosecutor, experience handling high-level cases, a spotless record, and prior service at the Department of Justice. Then she turned to Clay. "You looked at me and saw someone who didn't belong," she said. "But in truth, I belong to this courtroom, this law, and this justice system far longer than you could ever imagine." The plaintiff's bench straightened. A few members of the gallery tapped their thighs, trying to contain their emotions, but the mood had already shifted. Clay no longer held power in that room. The courtroom was packed, yet unnervingly quiet. Judge Nora Whitfield sat upright behind a bench, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze as sharp as a scalpel. After reviewing the cell phone video, clearly showing Clay Darnell pulling Celeste Monroe from her vehicle and handcuffing her without cause, she nodded slowly. "Before I issue my ruling," she said, "I have a question." She turned toward the legal counsel for the Kingsborough Police Department. "Can you explain why a black woman, sitting quietly in her own vehicle, was arrested solely because her presence made a police officer uncomfortable?" The defense attorney gripped his pen, lips pressed tight. He hesitated, lost for words. The judge nodded, not waiting for a reply. Then she turned to Clay, who now bore none of the arrogance from before. His face was pale, his shirt collar soaked with sweat. "Officer Clay Darnell," the judge began, "based on irrefutable evidence and sworn testimony, I hereby order your immediate suspension from duty. You are to undergo mandatory ethics and sensitivity training, and a full internal investigation will be launched to review your entire 10-year work history." The courtroom fell into stillness, then erupted in murmurs like a passing storm. It wasn't just a blow from the court. It was a reckoning delivered by the very person once treated as a victim, now a living symbol of a truth that refused to be buried. Celeste stepped down from the witness stand, not sparing Clay a second glance. But every other gaze in the room remained fixed on him, the man who had just lost everything to the very arrogance he once wore like armor. The room stayed hushed following the harsh ruling against Clay Darnell. But Celeste Monroe did not sit down. She stood tall, her voice cutting clearly through the tension in the air. "Your Honor, I have an additional request." Judge Nora Whitfield looked up, her brow furrowing slightly, but not with surprise. She gave a nod of consent. "I request a federal investigation into all arrests and incident reports made by Officer Darnell over the past 18 years. Based on the pattern of conduct, racial bias, and abuse of authority demonstrated in this case, I believe this is not an isolated incident." Whispers spread rapidly through the courtroom. Several journalists jumped to their feet, scribbling furiously. The defense attorney representing the Kingsborough Police Department shifted uncomfortably, his face paling, while Clay stared downward, his fists tightening on his knees, the smugness from that morning long gone. Judge Whitfield leaned back slightly, tapping her pen against the bench. "Request noted. I concur. To ensure impartiality, the Office of the Federal Inspector General will be brought in." Just then, a young prosecutor from the gallery stood up, raising a light brown folder. "Your Honor," he said, "with your permission, I'd like to submit a list of 27 arrests previously handled by Officer Darnell that show signs of irregularities. At least 19 of the individuals involved were black, many of whom were detained without clear charges and later released without explanation." Celeste turned to the young colleague. She nodded gently, a nod of gratitude, as if affirming to herself that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. Judge Whitfield accepted the folder, flipped through a few pages, and then paused. "Justice will not end here. This court will submit a formal request for a federal investigation to the Department of Justice by the end of the day." Clay Darnell sat quietly at the defendant's table, his shoulders no longer squared. The police uniform he once wore like a costume of authority now made him look out of place, an actor who had forgotten his lines. His eyes drifted aimlessly, as if he couldn't quite believe that what was happening to him. For 18 years, Clay believed himself untouchable. He had shoved black residents into the backs of police cruisers without clear cause. He had doctor reports. He had watched complaints disappear beneath layers of bureaucracy. He lived inside the shell of his badge and power, and believed it would never crack. But today, that shell shattered. To Clay, Celeste Monroe was no longer just another wrongfully arrested black woman. She was a federal chief prosecutor, the one who had pushed him to the edge, not with yelling, but with reason and undeniable truth. She hadn't wielded her power like a sword. She had held it up like a mirror, forcing him to confront the man reflected back. A court officer stepped beside Clay, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You need to stand up." Clay didn't move. He looked around the courtroom. The space that once felt like a stage, now the setting of his unraveling. Reporters scribbled without pause. Cameras flashed like lightning. And in the gallery, people stood quietly, not to jeer, but as if witnessing a sacred unmasking, where justice finally dared to name the one who violated it. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer said again, this time more firmly. Clay slowly rose, his legs heavy as stone. The cold click of the cuffs against his wrist wasn't tight, but it was enough. It told him this was real. This was no performance. Celeste remained standing, her gaze steady, not triumphant, but composed. As Clay passed her, their eyes met for a fleeting second. "You once believed justice was silent," Celeste said softly, but it was only waiting for the right voice. He didn't reply. He couldn't. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, Clay Darnell knew his career and the illusion of invincibility he had built around it were over, not dismantled slowly through bureaucracy, but shattered in less than an hour by a courtroom, by the truth, by a woman who refused to be erased. And he would not be the last. Because once justice awakens, it does not go back to sleep. As the door sealed shut behind Clay Darnell, there were no cheers, no applause, only silence, echoing with deeper meaning. The kind that marks the moment a system begins to see itself. The fall of the man who thought himself untouchable was not the end. It was only the beginning. Outside the Kingsborough County Courthouse, a crowd had gathered, not to chant but to listen. Cameras, microphones, spotlights, all turned toward one woman emerging through the old stone archway, her head held high, shoulders squared, her white blouse unwrinkled and immaculate. Celeste Monroe, federal chief prosecutor for Southern Mississippi, paused on the third step, with a golden afternoon sun painted the scene in hues both sacred and raw. A CNN reporter raised a hand. "Ms. Monroe, what is the most important thing you've taken from all of this?" Celeste looked into the camera, her brown eyes glowing, not with victory, but with the quiet power of truth being spoken aloud. "Justice," she began, "is not punishment. It's transparency. It's the ability to stand up and say, I am just as accountable as anyone else. No one, badge, power, or title, is above the law." A wave of silence rippled through the crowd. Then, one by one, people began to nod, raising their signs high. Accountability is justice. No one above the law. We stand with Celeste. That night, her words appeared on the front page of nearly every national media outlet. Her simple statement was shared millions of times, printed on T-shirts, posted in law office windows, and hung in university lecture halls. A new rallying cry for a movement to reform the justice system. Justice is accountability. No one is immune. At a high school in Jackson, a 13-year-old girl wrote an essay titled, "I Want to Be Celeste Monroe." In New Orleans, a young police officer requested transfer to internal affairs to make sure wrongdoing doesn't keep getting ignored. And in Kingsborough, the town once cloaked in silence and fear, residents began to rise, not just to protest, but to propose. They called for mandatory anti-bias training, anonymous reporting hotlines, and the creation of an independent oversight board. It all began with one wrongful arrest, but it ended with something far greater: trust restored, and a nation beginning to learn how to finally listen to itself.